Hello. So, let's get into it. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about acceptance testing and why I think acceptance testing is probably the most important testing you can do. And if you only make one type of investment in terms of testing, this should be that investment. However, this is also a very costly process. But before we get into all of it, I'll just define something. So for me, there are three types of tests. You have unit tests, which tests a single function. You have integration tests that tests a flow of events, such as posting some data to an endpoint or something like that. You're hitting a route on your server and you're expecting that a certain sequence of things are going to happen in a certain way. To me, that's an integration test. And then you have acceptance tests or end-to-end tests, call it what you want, which is basically the idea that you have a test that simulates the way a user is going to interact with your application. Now, this may or may not be very obvious to you, but if you think about it, as you change things in your system, odds are that at some point you're going to break something unintentionally. You know, that's the way that bugs work. You don't mean to put them in there, but they're still going to slip in there. And the only thing you really want to be absolutely sure about when you push something out into production is that the most critical parts of your business or your application are still working. Think about it. You want to be sure, because you are absolutely you're never going to be able to be bug free. No one can be bug free. So if you accept that you can't be bug free, what is the first thing you want to make sure every time you push something into, you push new code out into production? Well, I argue that what you want to be sure about is that everybody can buy the stuff that they're buying, or, access the critical parts of your system. That's the most important thing. And that's what an acceptance test should be testing. So you should, in my opinion, have a solution or something like, if you, let's say that you may have heard about Puppeteer, and you may have heard about Gherkin and like Selenium, behavioral driven development or BDD. All these concepts are gearing towards what I'm saying. The idea is that you simulate a user interacting with your application just as any user. And if any of those tests break, you know that, all right, we broke something, like we created what we call a regression. And regression means that something that was working earlier is now broken. And these tests are the most powerful tests that you can write. They are unfortunately also a little bit expensive to invest in. This is the sort of test that a lot of companies try to avoid. And usually what happens is that instead they have manual testing. This is the case at my company, for example. Instead of writing a test that asserts that that everybody can use the different features that we find to be critical with the system, we do it manually. And we do it fairly, not that, how do I put it? I mean, it's not feasible if you think about it from time and an economics perspective. I can't, when I push something in a new feature into the code and it goes out into production, there is no way I'm going to sit there and test that nothing else broke in the entire system. In theory, I should. In practice, no one, I don't, and very few people do. That's what the idea of acceptance testing is about, that if you just add a test for the stuff that you're adding in, you don't have to regression test the whole system, because you have automated tools that do it for you. Now, this represents a fairly large investment, and what I want to tell you is that, to me, there is one clear scenario where you absolutely want to invest in this. And that is that if you have the sort of application that has enough moving parts that it is impossible for you to cover all the sane, if you will, scenarios for what could have been broken when you pushed code to production, you absolutely need acceptance testing. And now, when I was working at Ticketmaster, I was actually introduced to this concept. And at first I was kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is interesting. I'm not so sure where the value comes. But I very quickly, oh God, how quickly did I learn. So to give you a bit of an understanding, the Ticketmaster's webpage is here in Europe catering to several different countries, and they all share the same platform. Think of it as a big WordPress site for selling tickets virtually. And that means that there is lots of configurations, like lots and lots and lots and lots of configurations. And if you think about that in theory, that means that any change you make to the code needs to be verified in all the different configuration settings. And so every time you push a feature that affects more than one country or so forth, you have to test for each scenario. You have to verify with each of the different countries and their settings. That very quickly becomes an extremely costly problem. And for a company that has the size like Ticketmaster, it's not feasible to have like tons of people who basically, because you basically have to regression test the whole thing. Like, it's very important to their business that things are working, because if the site goes down even for a single country for just a few hours, like that's millions of in revenue, right, lost. So how do you solve that? Well, you do that through acceptance testing, because fact is that you can't in a reasonable amount of time have like humans sit and try out all the different possible things that could have broken, when there's so many different configurations and complexity to the system. So it's the only sane way to approach that problem. Now, that's where I think that you should, like, for a company of that size, I think that there's no such thing like having a really good, really strong and really useful acceptance tests is absolutely paramount. For a smaller company, which is more likely the case that you might find yourself working in, I would say that you should have a few tests, just a few. And this is not costly. Like anybody, this will take you maybe a day or two to set up. And if you just kind of identify what the critical parts of your system is, like say for the company that I work for now, I would say that the most critical thing for us to make sure that it works properly is two things. The first and foremost thing to make sure that it works is that the user can go into the application, log in, and get to the bank discover, or what we call the bank discovery page, which is basically a page where we list all of the different, like basically we check all the transactions, all the transaction data that they give us access to, like the banks and so forth, and then we list all the different subscriptions. Being able to see that overview, that's critical, because that's the core value that the application is providing. The second part is that the user can get to that page and that they can cancel, like change a subscription, because that's where the business is going to make its money. If you change to another contract, or if we can offer you a better deal, that's revenue for the company. And those are only two scenarios that you want to test for, and you don't have to be crazier than that. But the thing is that if you have those tests there, you are guaranteed that every single time you push something out into production, that at the very least, even if everything else is on fire, the core functionality is there. And that's the benefit of having acceptance tests.